tracks put 'em. My pipe.
I've been feeding the same Bigfoot since 1986, and what he finally revealed to me about why his kind fears humans is something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. Some people will call me crazy for admitting this publicly, but after nearly 4 decades of keeping this secret, I believe it's time the world knows the truth. My name is Robert Hayes. I'm 66 years old and a retired forest ranger from the Mount Baker National Forest in Washington State. What I'm about to tell you isn't folklore, isn't campfire stories, and isn't the product of an overactive imagination. This is what happened, documented in journals I've kept locked away for decades, and it changes everything we think we know about these creatures. The autumn of 1986 painted the forests of the Pacific Northwest in shades of amber and crimson. I was 28 years old back then, a newly appointed forest ranger fresh out of the forestry program at Washington State University, eager to prove myself in my first real posting. I'd grown up in Seattle, spending my summers camping with my father in the Cascade Mountains, developing a deep respect for wilderness that eventually turned into a career. The crisp October air carried the scent of pine and decomposing leaves as I made my way through the dense woodland that fateful day. It was supposed to be just another routine patrol, checking trail markers, documenting wildlife activity, the usual duties that filled my weeks. My supervisor, a veteran ranger named Dave Wilson, had warned me during orientation about the isolation that came with the job. "Out here, you're on your own most of the time," Dave had said, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee mug in the station radio. "Only works in certain spots. You see something strange, you document it, but you don't go looking for trouble. These woods have been here longer than any of us, and they've got their secrets." I'd nodded along, thinking Dave was just being dramatic the way older rangers sometimes were. After all, what could possibly happen? I was trained for emergencies, knew how to handle wildlife encounters, had studied every protocol in the handbook. I was prepared for bears, mountain lions, even the occasional lost hiker. What I wasn't prepared for was what happened on October 15th, 1986. It was late afternoon, around 4:30, and the sun was already beginning its descent behind the towering Douglas firs. I was investigating reports of damaged property at an old hunting cabin about 6 miles from the main trail. The cabin belonged to a local family named the Hendersons, who used it during deer season, and they'd reported finding their storage shed torn apart, food supplies scattered and destroyed. As I approached the clearing where the cabin sat nestled among the trees, I immediately noticed something was wrong. The destruction wasn't typical of bears, and I'd seen plenty of bear damage during my training and early months on the job. This was something different, something that made the hair on my neck stand up even before I fully processed what I was seeing. The shed's heavy wooden door hadn't just been clawed or pried open like a bear would do. It had been literally wrenched off its metal hinges with what must have been incredible focused force. The hinges themselves were bent and twisted, the screws pulled straight out of solid timber. Canned goods were scattered across a 20-foot radius, some of them dented as if they'd been thrown. A 50-pound bag of flour had been torn open, and its contents spread across the ground in a pattern that suggested it had been examined, not just destroyed randomly. But what really caught my attention, what made my professional training collide head-on with something inexplicable, were the tracks. Large, deep impressions in the soft earth around the shed, pressed into the mud with such force that water had seeped into them from below. I knelt down to examine them more closely, pulling out my measuring tape and camera from my ranger pack. My hands were already trembling slightly. though I didn't want to admit why the prints were enormous, at least 17 inches long and 7 inches wide at the widest part. They were vaguely humanoid in shape, with 5 distinct toe impressions arranged in a pattern similar to human feet. But the scale was all wrong. Far, far too large to be human. The depth of the impressions, the way they'd compressed the soil in layers, suggested something incredibly heavy, probably weighing somewhere between 600 and 800 pounds based on my estimates and the soil conditions. My heart began to race as I studied them. In all my training, in all the wildlife identification manuals I'd practically memorized, nothing quite matched what I was seeing. Bears left distinctive claw marks extending from their toe pads. These prints showed no claws whatsoever, just broad, flat impressions with clear toe definition that looked disturbingly like massively oversized bare human feet. The stride length between prints was astounding, easily 6 feet or more, suggesting a bipedal gait with legs much longer than any humans. I spent the next hour methodically documenting everything, taking photographs from multiple angles with my 35mm camera, making detailed plaster casts of the best preserved prints, measuring and recording the stride patterns, sketching the scene in my field notebook with precise annotations. The professional part of my brain was cataloging data, following protocols, doing everything by the book. But another part, a more primal part, buried deep in human evolutionary memory, was screaming at me to leave this place immediately. The forest had grown unnaturally, oppressively quiet around me. No bird songs echoing through the canopy, no rustling of squirrels or chipmunks in the underbrush, no distant calls of ravens, just an eerie silence that seemed to press in from all sides like a physical weight. I'd read about this phenomenon in my wildlife behavior courses, how animals in a forest will go completely silent when a major predator enters the area. Every creature simultaneously decides that making any sound is too dangerous. My hand instinctively moved to the canister of bear spray secured on my hip, though some part of me already knew that whatever had made these tracks wasn't a bear. That's when I heard it for the first time. A sound I would come to know well over the following decades, but in that moment it was utterly alien and terrifying. A low, guttural vocalization that seemed to resonate through the trees themselves, vibrating in my chest cavity. Not quite a growl like a bear or cougar would make, not quite a howl like a wolf, but something in between, something that carried intelligence and intention. It came from somewhere deeper in the forest, maybe 100 yards away, maybe less. The acoustics of dense woodland made it impossible to judge precisely. The hair on the back of my neck stood straight up. Every instinct carved into human DNA over millions of years told me to run, to flee, to get away from this place immediately. But my training kicked in, overriding the panic. I slowly, carefully backed toward my truck, which was parked on the dirt access road about 50 yards from the cabin. I kept my eyes on the tree line, scanning constantly for any sign of movement, any shape that didn't belong. My camera still hung around my neck, bumping against my chest with each backward step. My notepad remained clutched in one hand, the other hovering near my bear spray, though I had no idea if it would even work against whatever had made those sounds. My breath came in short, controlled gasps as I fought to maintain composure. Then I saw it, and my entire understanding of reality shifted in that instant. Between two massive old-growth cedar trees, partially obscured by shadow and thick undergrowth, stood a figure. My brain, desperate to make sense of the impossible, initially tried to rationalize it as another person. Maybe a hunter in dark camouflage clothing, maybe another hiker who'd gotten lost. But as my eyes adjusted to the contrast between the bright clearing and the shadowed forest, As the figure shifted its weight slightly and the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy caught its form, that rationalization crumbled like wet paper. It was massive beyond any human scale, easily 8 feet tall, possibly more, with proportions that were almost human, but distinctly wrong in ways that triggered deep unease. Covered head to toe in dark brown hair that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, with broad shoulders that would make a professional football linebacker look like a child. The arms were disproportionately long, hanging down past where the knees would be. And it was watching me with obvious, unmistakable intention. This wasn't an animal that had accidentally crossed my path. This was a thinking being that had chosen to reveal itself. I froze completely, every muscle locked in place. This wasn't in any ranger manual, wasn't covered in any training protocol. This wasn't supposed to exist outside of tabloid headlines and late-night television shows. Yet here it stood, as real as the trees around us, as undeniable as the ground beneath my feet. The creature didn't move aggressively. It didn't charge, didn't beat its chest, didn't display any of the threatening behaviors I might have expected from a territorial animal. It simply stood there in the shadows, partially concealed, observing me with what seemed like calculated assessment. I could make out more details now as my eyes fully adjusted to the contrast, and my initial shock began to fade into sharp, almost painful clarity. A face that was remarkably expressive, more human than ape in its structure, with deep-set eyes that reflected a glimmer of the fading daylight. The eyes held intelligence, unmistakable and profound. A prominent sagittal crest ran along the top of its skull, similar to what I'd seen in pictures of male gorillas, but more pronounced and swept back. The face was relatively hairless compared to the body, showing dark, weathered skin beneath. The nose was broad and flat, the mouth wide, and as it slightly parted its lips, I caught a glimpse of large, yellowed teeth. Time seemed to stop, or perhaps my perception of it became distorted by the surge of adrenaline flooding my system. I couldn't say later whether we stood there staring at each other for 30 seconds or 3 full minutes. Everything else faded away. The forest, the damaged cabin behind me, my duty, my training, my very identity as a ranger. In that moment, there was only this impossible confrontation between two beings who, by all conventional wisdom, should never have met face to face. My photographer's instinct, that professional drive to document everything, screamed at me to raise the camera hanging around my neck, to capture this impossible moment, to provide proof that would change science and biology forever. But my hands wouldn't cooperate. They remained frozen, one still clutching my field notebook so tightly my knuckles had turned white, the other still hovering uselessly near my bear spray, as if that small canister could protect me from something so massive and powerful. The creature made another sound, softer this time, less resonant, almost inquisitive in tone. Its head tilted slightly to one side, a gesture so remarkably human-like it sent chills down my spine. Then, with a movement so swift and fluid, it seemed physically impossible for something of that size and bulk. It turned and disappeared into the dense forest. I heard the sound of heavy footfalls, branches snapping and undergrowth being displaced. But the sounds faded quickly as whatever I'd seen moved away with practiced ease through terrain that would have slowed a human to a crawl. The forest remained silent for several more minutes, as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting to see if the encounter was truly over. I honestly didn't remember getting into my truck. My next clear memory was sitting behind the wheel, hands shaking so violently I could barely fit the key into the ignition. Sweat had soaked through my uniform shirt despite the cool October air. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I could feel it in my throat. I had to try 3 times before I could start the engine, my hands fumbling and trembling. The drive back to the ranger station passed in a daze, my mind racing with what I'd witnessed, trying and failing to rationalize it into something explainable, something that fit within the boundaries of known reality. When I arrived at the ranger station just after sunset, the sky painted in deep purples and oranges, Dave Wilson was still there finishing up some end-of-day paperwork. The older ranger, probably in his mid-50s, with gray streaking through his beard and deep lines around his eyes from decades of squinting at distant horizons, took one look at my pale face and immediately poured me a cup of coffee from the pot that seemed to be perpetually brewing in the corner of the small office. His movements were practiced and calm, the kind of steadiness that comes from years of handling emergencies and stressed-out rangers. "You look like you've seen a ghost, kid," Dave said, settling into the worn chair across from me, with his own mug. "What happened out there?" I opened my mouth to speak, then closed it again, my throat tight and dry despite the coffee I'd just sipped. How could I possibly explain what I'd seen? How could I put into words an encounter that defied everything we were supposed to know about wildlife in these forests? Dave would think I was losing my mind, suffering from isolation-induced hallucinations, or worse, that I couldn't handle the psychological demands of the job. I'd be reassigned to desk work, maybe even let go during my probationary period. All my dreams of being a forest ranger, of protecting and studying these wild places, would evaporate because I'd seen something that wasn't supposed to exist. "Just had a close call with what might have been a bear," I finally said, the lie tasting bitter and wrong in my mouth. "Got spooked. I'm fine now, just needed a minute." Dave studied me for a long moment with those sharp grey eyes that had seen everything these mountains had to offer over his 3 decades of service. He knew I wasn't telling the full truth. I could see it in the way his gaze lingered on my face, the way he slowly sipped his coffee while watching me. But for whatever reason, whether out of respect for a rookie's privacy or understanding that sometimes rangers need to process things alone, he let it go. "The cabin damage? You document it?" he asked after a pause, steering the conversation to safer ground. "Yeah," I said, grateful for the shift. I pulled out my camera and field notebook, setting them on the desk between us, took photos and measurements, made some plaster casts of tracks. They're unusual. Might be a large bear, but the prints don't quite match any bear sign I've studied. Dave flipped through my notebook, examining my sketches and measurements with professional interest. He paused on the page where I'd drawn the massive footprints, his eyebrows raising slightly. "These are something," he murmured. "We'll file the report. Keep an eye on that sector, good work being thorough." He closed the notebook and pushed it back toward me, but his eyes held mine for another moment. And I swear I saw something there, recognition maybe, or shared knowledge of something neither of us was willing to name out loud. Over the following weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. The image of that massive figure standing between the cedars was burned into my mind. Replaying every time I closed my eyes, I returned to the cabin area repeatedly during my patrols, always finding fresh tracks in the soft soil near the creek, always experiencing that peculiar sensation of being watched from the shadows, but never catching another glimpse of the creature itself. The logical, trained part of my brain tried desperately to dismiss the encounter as a trick of fading light, exhaustion from a long day, even temporary hallucination brought on by stress or isolation. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew it with absolute certainty, the kind of bone-deep knowing that doesn't require external validation. By late November, as the first snows began dusting the higher elevations, I'd developed a new routine that I couldn't quite justify professionally, but felt compelled to maintain I identified a specific clearing about a mile from where I'd first seen the creature. A small meadow surrounded by old-growth timber with a large, flat boulder at its center. The location was off the main trails, secluded, but still within reasonable distance of the access roads. I started leaving food there. At first, just small offerings, an apple from my lunch, a handful of trail mix, things I could easily explain away if anyone asked. Then gradually more, dried meat from my provisions, nuts, energy bars, whatever I could spare from my own supplies without arousing suspicion about where it was all going. I told myself I was conducting an unofficial wildlife study, gathering data on scavenger patterns and food competition among forest animals. But the truth was far more complex and deeply personal. I was drawn to this mystery in a way I couldn't fully explain or articulate, even to myself, in the privacy of my own thoughts. Something about that brief encounter had changed me fundamentally. I needed to understand what I'd seen. More than that, I needed to know if it could happen again, if communication or at least coexistence was possible. For months, nothing conclusive happened. The food would disappear overnight, reliably and completely, but that proved nothing definitive. Deer, raccoons, black bears, coyotes, any number of animals could have been taking advantage of an unexpected food source. I documented everything meticulously in a separate notebook I kept hidden in my cabin, noting what I left, when I left it, weather conditions, what I found upon my return visits. The scientist in me demanded evidence, patterns, something concrete to validate what I was doing. But another part of me, a part I was only beginning to acknowledge, didn't need validation. That part simply knew. Then, one morning in March 1987, on a crisp day when the forest smelled of thawing earth and new growth, I found something that changed everything and validated every instinct that had kept me coming back to that clearing. Arranged carefully on the flat boulder where I'd been leaving food were 3 smooth river stones, stacked precisely in a small cairn formation. They weren't naturally positioned. Wind and weather didn't create structures like this. It was deliberate, unmistakable, impossible to dismiss or rationalize. Something had taken the time and care to select these stones, to balance them carefully one atop another, to leave this message in response to my offerings. My hands trembled as I photographed the cairn from multiple angles, documenting it as thoroughly as I documented everything else. This wasn't random environmental occurrence. This wasn't animal behavior as we understood it. This was communication, intentional and clear. Something intelligent had been accepting my food and now was acknowledging the exchange, perhaps even expressing gratitude or simply reciprocating the gesture of goodwill. I sat down on the forest floor right there, my back against a tree, and stared at those 3 stacked stones for nearly an hour, my mind reeling with the implications. I started varying what I left after that discovery, testing the boundaries of this strange new relationship. Fresh fruit beyond just apples, oranges and pears and bunches of grapes, vegetables like carrots and potatoes, even cooked food carefully wrapped in wax paper, simple things like baked chicken or grilled fish. Each time I'd return, sometimes the next day, sometimes after 2 or 3 days, I'd find the food completely gone and small signs left behind in its place. Stones arranged in geometric patterns that couldn't be natural, strips of cedar bark laid in cross formations. Once I found a perfectly intact bird skeleton, tiny and delicate, positioned carefully in the center of the boulder as if displayed for my examination. These weren't animal behaviors, as any wildlife biologist would recognize them. This was intelligence, curiosity, deliberate reciprocation of a gift exchange ritual. By summer of 1987, emboldened by months of these exchanges and driven by an overwhelming need to make direct contact again, I'd gotten considerably bolder in my approach. I started staying near the clearing after leaving food, sitting quietly against a moss-covered tree trunk about 30 yards from the boulder, making myself visible but maintaining what I hoped was a non-threatening posture. I'd read about habituation techniques used with wildlife, the slow process of building trust through consistent, predictable behavior. But this felt fundamentally different from anything in those academic papers. This felt like I was being tested, evaluated, slowly accepted or rejected based on criteria I could only guess at. August 17th, 1987 was the day everything changed again. The day theory became reality and hope became tangible connection. I was sitting in my usual spot, back against the trunk of a large Douglas fir, when I heard movement in the dense undergrowth to my left. Not the random rustling of deer or the scurrying of smaller animals, but deliberate heavy movement. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I forced myself to stay absolutely still, fighting every impulse to stand or retreat. Then he emerged from between the salal bushes and sword ferns, the same creature from that October afternoon 10 months earlier, and he was even more massive and impressive than I remembered. In the bright summer light, unfiltered by evening shadows, I could see details I'd missed during our first brief encounter. His face was remarkably expressive, surprisingly human in its structure despite the heavy brow. Ridge and broad, flat nose, deep-set eyes that held unmistakable intelligence, awareness, and curiosity. His body was covered in long, dark brown hair, matted and tangled in some places, surprisingly clean and well-groomed in others. His hands, visible as he pushed aside the undergrowth, were enormous, easily twice the size of my own, with thick fingers that ended in prominent curved nails that looked more like human fingernails than animal claws. We stared at each other across maybe 20 feet of forest floor, carpeted with pine needles and moss. I didn't move, didn't even dare to breathe normally, taking only shallow, quiet breaths through my nose. He made a soft sound, lower in pitch than the vocalizations from our first encounter, almost like an inquisitive question. Slowly, moving as carefully as if approaching a spooked horse, I raised my right hand, with my palm facing outward in what I desperately hoped was a universal gesture of peaceful intention. He tilted his massive head to one side, studying me with obvious, unmistakable curiosity. His eyes tracked the movement of my hand, then returned to my face, then back to my hand. He was analyzing, thinking, deciding. Then he took a step forward, just one step, but it closed the distance between us to maybe 15 feet, and every muscle in my body screamed at me to run, to flee, to get away from something so large and powerful. But I held my ground, keeping my hand raised, maintaining eye contact without staring. Aggressively, he approached the boulder, where I'd left that morning's offering, a bag containing several apples and some smoked salmon I'd prepared the night before. Without taking his eyes off me, moving with surprising delicacy for something so massive, he reached down and extracted one of the apples. He brought it to his mouth and bit into it, the sound of crunching fruit loud in the quiet clearing, still watching me intently the entire time. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only a minute or two, he made another sound, lower and more relaxed in tone, almost like contentment. Then he turned, moving with that same fluid grace I'd witnessed before, and walked back into the forest. But this time, he paused at the tree line and looked back at me one final time before disappearing into the shadows. It felt like acknowledgement, like acceptance, like the beginning of something neither of us fully understood, but both of us were willing to explore. I sat there for another hour after he'd gone, shaking with adrenaline and wonder. I'd just had a peaceful interaction with a creature science claimed didn't exist. Over the following months, These encounters became more frequent. He'd appear when I left food, always cautious, always maintaining distance. But growing more comfortable with my presence, I started calling him Marcus in my mind, needing some way to think of him as an individual. By winter, Marcus would sometimes sit on the opposite side of the clearing while I was there, and we'd spend time in silence, just existing in the same space. It felt profound in ways I couldn't articulate. Marcus made a series of sounds I'd never heard before, complex vocalizations that seemed almost like speech. The female approached slowly, obviously nervous. I stayed completely still, letting her assess me on her own terms. After several minutes, she came closer to the food I'd brought. I'd started bringing more substantial offerings, entire bags of produce, dried meats, even fish I'd caught. She took some apples, never taking her eyes off me, then retreated. Over the next few weeks, she became as comfortable with my presence as Marcus was. I called her Diana. The true miracle came in late 1993, one November afternoon. I arrived to find both Marcus and Diana waiting, but there was a new energy about them. Marcus made urgent sounds, gesturing toward the deeper forest he wanted me to follow. Every ranger protocol screamed this was dangerous, but after 7 years, I trusted him. I followed them deeper into the woods than I'd ever gone before, to a small cave system I hadn't known existed. Inside, carefully bedded with moss and leaves, was Diana. She was giving birth. I stayed at the cave entrance, giving them privacy but ready to help if needed. Hours passed. The sounds Diana made were almost human in their pain and effort. Marcus stayed beside her, touching her shoulder, making soothing sounds when the infant finally emerged, tiny and vulnerable. I felt tears streaming down my face. I was witnessing something no human had ever seen. The baby was perfect, maybe 20 pounds, covered in fine dark hair, eyes squeezed shut against the world. Diana cleaned her infant with gentle care, while Marcus watched, his massive hand resting protectively on both of them. They let me approach after an hour. The baby was nursing, making small, squeaking sounds. Diana watched me carefully as I knelt nearby. I'd brought my medical kit and showed her the supplies. She watched as I set them within reach, understanding the gesture. The baby was healthy, perfect. I called her Emma. Over the following years, I watched Emma grow from infant to child to adolescent. Marcus taught her survival skills, while Diana protected and encouraged her. They were parents in every sense, and I was watching a family that science claimed couldn't exist. I documented everything in private journals kept locked away. By then, I'd been promoted to senior ranger and used that authority to protect their territory, redirecting trails and quietly discouraging hunting in specific zones. In 1998, something changed. Marcus appeared at the clearing one day without Diana or Emma. His behavior was agitated, urgent. He made sounds and gestures I'd learned meant danger. He wanted me to follow again. We went deeper into the forest, to a place I'd never been. What he showed me there made everything make sense and broke my heart. It was a grave site, unmistakably. 3 mounds covered with stones and branches, carefully arranged, but that wasn't what Marcus wanted to show me. He knelt beside the graves and began to expose something beneath the stone's bones, human-like but massive, the skeleton of one of his kind. But these bones told a story, a terrible story. The skull had a bullet hole, the ribs were broken, several bones showed saw marks. This wasn't natural death. This was violence, systematic and cruel. Marcus made sounds I'd never heard before, something between grief and rage. He touched the bones gently, reverently. Then he began to show me scars I'd never noticed before. Across his back, old marks that could only be from restraints. On his leg, A healed break that had set poorly. On his shoulder, what looked like a brand mark. He'd been captured, held, hurt. He was showing me his history, his people's history, why they feared humans, why they hid. I knelt beside him, tears streaming. I understood now they'd been hunted not just for sport, but for capture, study, exploitation. These graves held his family, his people, killed by humans who saw them as animals or monsters rather than intelligent beings. Marcus looked at me with eyes that held decades of pain and asked a silent question. Could I be trusted with this knowledge? Could any human? I placed my hand over my heart, then reached out slowly and placed it over his. A promise I would protect them, I would keep their secret, I would never betray this trust. Over the next decade, that promise was tested repeatedly. Hikers would report strange sounds or sightings. Each time I'd investigate officially and conclude it was bears or elk. Misidentified in poor lighting, other rangers would want to follow up. I'd volunteer, then find nothing. I became known as skeptical of Bigfoot reports, which was perfect cover. But in 2009, something happened that I couldn't redirect. A group of hunters had been working the area for weeks, specifically looking for Bigfoot. They had sophisticated equipment, trail cameras, motion sensors. They weren't casual enthusiasts. They were organized, funded, determined. One of their cameras caught Diana on film for 3 seconds. It was enough. The footage wasn't clear, but it was compelling. They started camping in sectors dangerously close to where Marcus, Diana, and Emma spent most of their time. I tried everything official to move them, claimed wildlife studies, fire danger, anything. Nothing worked. They had permits, rights to be there. I started hiking the territory constantly, trying to keep tabs on both the hunters and the family, trying to anticipate problems. I was 60 then, not as fast or strong as I'd been at 28, but fear and love made me capable of more than I thought possible. In early December 2009, the situation came to a head. I was checking on Marcus and his family when I heard voices, human voices. Too close, I found them at a small grove where Diana and Emma often rested. Diana was hurt, a gunshot wound in her shoulder. Not fatal, but serious. Emma was terrified, trying to help her mother. Marcus stood between them and the direction the shot had come from, every muscle tensed for violence. I could hear the hunters moving through the forest, tracking the blood trail. They knew they'd hit something, and they were coming to claim it. I had maybe 5 minutes. I pulled out my first aid kit and went to Diana. She was in pain, but tried to stand when I approached. Marcus made a warning sound, but Diana quieted him. She remembered me, trusted me. I cleaned the wound quickly, packed it with gauze, wrapped it tight. It wasn't proper medical care, but it would slow the bleeding. Emma watched everything, learning. The hunters were getting closer. I could hear their excited voices, talking about the blood trail. I turned to Marcus and made gestures I hoped he'd understand. Go. Deep, far, don't come back. His eyes held mine. He understood. He helped Diana up, Emma supporting her other side. They moved deeper into the forest, toward the old growth where the terrain got rough, where few humans ventured. The hunters emerged minutes after the family disappeared. 3 men with rifles following the blood trail. One recognized me. Hayes, what are you doing out here? Investigating reports, I said calmly. I heard shots. You hunting illegally? We got one, the leader said excitedly. Hit it clean. The blood trail leads right through here. I looked at the tracks leading deeper into forest. You need to leave immediately. This sector is closed for a wildlife disease study. I'm ordering you out. Disease study? Since when? Since I say so. I'm the senior ranger. You got 30 minutes to clear out, or I'm calling state police for illegal hunting. You're protecting them, one said. I stepped closer. You shot something in a restricted area. didn't report it, and you're refusing a ranger's order. That's 3 violations. Want to argue with lawyers or leave quietly? The standoff lasted. Finally, the leader spat and gestured to the others. Let's go. They left. I waited, then followed the blood trail. I found the family 2 miles in. I gave Marcus everything: bandages, antiseptic, pain medication. He watched me work with intelligent attention. When finished, Diana made a soft sound of gratitude. Emma touched my hand for the first time. Then Marcus pulled me into an embrace, his massive arms surrounding me carefully. In that moment, I felt accepted beyond species. We were family. I knelt beside them, the reality sinking in. They'll come back. Not today, but they will. You have to go deeper, farther than you've ever gone, into the mountains where humans don't go. Marcus looked toward the distant peaks, snow-capped and remote. He understood. He turned to Diana, then to Emma, speaking to them in their way. They rose together, supporting each other. Before they left, Marcus placed his hand on my chest, over my heart. Then I placed mine on his, a final promise, a goodbye. They disappeared into the forest, 3 shadows returning to the ancient world. I never saw them again. I retired in 2016. Sometimes, when hikers file reports of strange sounds or impossible tracks, I smile. Somewhere beyond the roads and maps, a family still walks beneath the trees, quiet, cautious, enduring. I still leave apples on a stump deep in Mount Baker, where moss grows thick and the canopy swallows the sky. They're always gone by morning. Maybe it's deer, maybe raccoons, or maybe it's a promise being kept, because some secrets aren't meant to be solved, just honored.